Some betrayals cut so deep they leave scars on the soul, and some prisons have no bars except the lies that others build around us. I'm Eleanor, and I dedicate my life to preserving letters that tell stories of human cruelty and divine justice. Last week, while helping organize donated documents at the Boston Medical Historical Archive, I discovered a water-damaged leather portfolio tucked behind old surgical texts. Inside were the most heartbreaking yet ultimately triumphant letters I have ever encountered, written by a woman whose stepchildren betrayed her trust so completely that they stole 3 years of her life, convinced her she was insane, and nearly succeeded in destroying her spirit forever. This is the true story of Margaret Whitmore, a gentle widow who inherited a fortune only to discover that the children she loved as her own were willing to commit murder and fraud to steal everything from her, and Dr. Jonathan Reeves, the compassionate physician who risked his career to expose their crimes and restore her freedom. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were plotting your destruction behind your back? Share your experience in the comments, because Margaret's story will show you that sometimes our darkest hours are followed by the most brilliant dawn, and that angels can appear in the most unexpected forms when we need them most. New York City in the harsh winter of 1833 was a place where coal smoke mixed with snow to create a gray blanket over cobblestone streets, where elegant townhouses on Fifth Avenue stood as monuments to merchant wealth, and where the line between compassion and greed often determined whether the vulnerable were protected or preyed upon by those who claimed to love them. Margaret Whitmore stood at the frost-covered windows of her late husband's study in their grand mansion on Washington Square, watching carriages struggle through icy ruts while she tried to make sense of documents that seemed increasingly confusing despite her usual sharp mind and careful attention to detail. At 47, Margaret possessed the kind of gentle beauty that had deepened with maturity, silver threads in her brown hair catching the lamplight, green eyes that reflected both intelligence and the profound sadness that had settled over her life like a shroud since her husband Henry's sudden death 6 months earlier had left her alone with responsibilities she had never expected to bear. Henry Whitmore had been one of New York's most successful textile merchants, building his fortune through careful investments and honest dealing that had earned him respect throughout the business community while providing his family with luxuries that included their elegant home, fine furnishings from Europe, and the kind of social position that opened doors and created opportunities for those they loved. Margaret had entered Henry's life as his second wife when she was 25, and he was a widower of 42 with 3 young children who desperately needed a mother's care and guidance. Margaret had never been able to have children of her own, a sorrow that had cut deeply through her early married years until Henry's children had filled the empty places in her heart and given her purpose that went beyond social obligations and household management. Thomas, now 26, had been 8 years old when Margaret married his father, a bright boy whose intelligence and ambition had made him Henry's obvious successor in the family business, though Margaret had often worried about the calculating way he approached relationships and his tendency to view people as either useful or obstacles to his advancement. Elizabeth, 24, had been 6 when Margaret became her stepmother, a beautiful child who had grown into an equally lovely young woman whose charm and social grace had made her one of New York's most sought-after brides, though Margaret sometimes noticed a coldness in her eyes that seemed inconsistent with her warm public persona. William, the youngest at 22, had been only 4 when Margaret joined the family, practically raised by her from infancy, which made her love for him feel as natural and complete as any biological mother could experience, despite moments when she glimpsed flashes of cruelty that reminded her uncomfortably of stories Henry had told about his first wife's family. Margaret's relationship with Henry's children had been complicated from the beginning by their obvious resentment of her presence in their father's life and their suspicion that she was motivated by greed rather than genuine affection for Henry or concern for their welfare. But over the years she had poured so much love and attention into their lives that she had believed their initial hostility had evolved into mutual affection and respect that would continue after Henry's death. Margaret had supported Thomas through his education and early business ventures, had provided Elizabeth with the social connections and financial support necessary for her successful marriage to a prominent banker, and had treated William with the tenderness and patience that had helped him overcome childhood difficulties and develop into what appeared to be a responsible and caring young man. The reading of Henry's will had been the first indication that Margaret's assumptions about her relationship with his children might have been fundamentally mistaken, as their reaction to learning that Henry had left his entire fortune to her, with only modest provisions for them, had revealed depths of anger and resentment that she had never suspected existed beneath their facade of filial affection and gratitude. Henry's decision to leave everything to Margaret had been based on his confidence in her judgment and his desire to ensure that his wealth would be used wisely for the benefit of the family as a whole, including provisions for his children's future needs and the eventual distribution of assets that would provide them with substantial inheritances while protecting them from the temptations and corrupting influences that immediate wealth might create for young people who had not yet proven their character and wisdom. Margaret had been surprised by the extent of Henry's fortune, which included not only the textile business but also real estate investments, bank shares, and other assets that generated income far exceeding what she had imagined. But she had been even more shocked by the children's reaction to learning that they would have to depend on her generosity and judgment for their financial security rather than receiving immediate access to wealth that they apparently believed was rightfully theirs by birth rather than inheritance. Thomas's controlled fury, Elizabeth's tearful accusations of manipulation and favoritism, and William's sullen withdrawal had created an atmosphere of tension and hostility that had made Margaret's grief over Henry's death more difficult to bear while forcing her to question whether the love she had felt for them had been based on illusions rather than reality. In the weeks following Henry's funeral, Margaret had attempted to bridge the growing distance between herself and the children by involving them in decisions about the management of Henry's business interests and the distribution of income that could provide them with comfortable lives while preserving the principal that would eventually become their inheritance. Margaret's efforts to demonstrate her good intentions and her desire to treat them fairly had been met with suspicious scrutiny of her every decision and frequent suggestions that her judgment was being affected by grief and that she would benefit from professional advice that could protect both her interests and theirs from mistakes that emotional instability might cause her to make. The first signs that something was seriously wrong with Margaret's health had appeared gradually and subtly, beginning with occasional dizzy spells that made her unsteady on her feet, progressing to periods of confusion that made it difficult for her to focus on business documents and financial decisions, and eventually including episodes of nausea and weakness that left her bedridden for days at a time while the children expressed increasing concern about her condition and their worry that she was not receiving appropriate medical attention. The symptoms had been disturbing but not alarming enough to prevent Margaret from continuing to manage household affairs and business decisions, though she had begun to rely more heavily on the children's assistance and advice as her periods of clarity became shorter and her confidence in her own judgment began to waver. Thomas had been the first to suggest that Margaret's condition might be more serious than simple grief or temporary adjustment difficulties, pointing to her growing confusion about financial matters and her occasional inability to remember conversations or decisions from earlier in the same day as evidence that she might be suffering from the kind of mental decline that sometimes affected people who had experienced severe emotional trauma. Elizabeth had supported her brother's concerns with observations about Margaret's changing appearance, her loss of appetite, and her tendency to spend long periods staring out windows or sitting motionless in Henry's study as though she were trying to communicate with someone who was no longer there. William, whose closeness to Margaret made his opinion particularly influential, had been the most persuasive in arguing that she needed medical evaluation and possibly treatment that could address whatever physical or mental condition was causing her deteriorating health and increasingly erratic behavior. "Mother Margaret," he had said with apparent tears in his eyes during a family conference that had been arranged to discuss her condition, "we love you too much to watch you suffer without getting the help you need. Father would want us to take care of you the same way you took care of us when we were children and couldn't protect ourselves from harm." The physician who had been recommended by the children, Dr. Harrison Vale, had arrived at the mansion with impressive credentials and grave concern about Margaret's symptoms, conducting an examination that had confirmed their worst fears about her condition and their best hopes about the possibility of treatment that could restore her health and mental clarity if she were willing to submit to the intensive care that her situation required. Dr. Vale had diagnosed Margaret with a combination of physical ailments and mental instability that he attributed to the shock of losing her husband and the stress of managing responsibilities that were beyond her capacity to handle in her current state of health. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Vale had explained with professional gravity and compassionate concern, "your symptoms indicate a serious condition that requires immediate and sustained treatment in a facility where you can receive the specialized care that your situation demands. The confusion and physical weakness you are experiencing are signs of deterioration that will continue to worsen unless we intervene with treatments that cannot be provided adequately in a home environment, even with the most devoted family care and attention." The decision to commit Margaret to the Riverside Hospital for the treatment of nervous and physical disorders had been presented as a temporary measure that would allow her to receive the intensive medical attention needed to restore her health while protecting her from the stress and responsibility that were contributing to her decline. The facility, located on a quiet stretch of the Hudson River north of the city, had been described as a place of healing and restoration where patients received not only medical treatment but also the kind of peaceful environment and structured routine that promoted recovery from the various ailments that affected those whose minds and bodies had been weakened by trauma, overwork, or constitutional weakness. Margaret's memories of the day she had been taken to Riverside Hospital were fragmented and dreamlike, clouded by the medication that Dr. Vale had administered to calm her anxiety and make the transition easier for someone whose condition made travel and new environments particularly stressful and potentially harmful. She remembered the children's tearful farewells and their promises to visit frequently, their assurances that her stay would be brief and that she would return home as soon as her health improved, and their expressions of love and gratitude for all she had done for them over the years. The reality of Riverside Hospital had been quite different from the peaceful retreat that Margaret had been led to expect, revealing itself as a grim institution where patients were warehoused rather than treated, where staff members were more concerned with maintaining order than providing compassionate care, and where the treatments consisted primarily of restraints, sedatives, and isolation that were designed to make patients manageable rather than to promote genuine healing or recovery. Margaret's room was a small, poorly lit cell with barred windows that looked out on a courtyard where other patients wandered aimlessly or sat motionless on benches, their vacant expressions and shuffling movements creating an atmosphere of despair that made Margaret understand that this was not a place where people came to get better but a place where they were sent to be forgotten. The staff at Riverside Hospital treated Margaret with a combination of condescension and indifference that made it clear they viewed her not as a temporary patient who would recover and return to normal life but as someone whose family had paid for her permanent removal from society and who would remain in their custody indefinitely. The attendants who brought her meals and supervised her daily activities spoke to her as though she were a child or simpleton, ignoring her protests about her treatment and her requests to contact her family or legal representatives who might help her understand what was happening to her and when she would be allowed to go home. Margaret's attempts to maintain her sanity and dignity during her imprisonment at Riverside Hospital had required enormous strength of will and determination not to surrender to the despair that consumed most of the other patients who had been abandoned by their families and forgotten by the outside world. Margaret had used her intelligence and education to analyze her situation and develop strategies for survival that included careful observation of staff routines and patient treatment, documentation of conditions and procedures that violated basic standards of medical care, and cultivation of relationships with other patients whose stories revealed patterns of abuse and neglect that suggested systematic corruption within the institution. During her first year at Riverside Hospital, Margaret had gradually come to understand that her commitment was not temporary and that the children had no intention of bringing her home regardless of any improvements in her health or mental state. The visits that had been promised had never materialized, the letters she had written had gone unanswered, and the inquiries she had made about her financial affairs had been dismissed by staff members who informed her that such matters were being handled by her family and were no longer her concern or responsibility. The realization that she had been permanently abandoned by the children she had loved and trusted had been more devastating than the physical discomforts and psychological torments of institutional life, forcing Margaret to confront the possibility that their affection had been entirely false and that they had been planning her destruction from the moment they learned about Henry's will. Margaret's grief over this betrayal had been deeper than her sorrow about Henry's death, because it represented not only the loss of relationships she had treasured but also the discovery that her entire understanding of those relationships had been based on lies and deception. The turning point in Margaret's imprisonment had come during her third year at Riverside Hospital, when changes in the institution's medical staff had brought a new physician whose approach to patient care was fundamentally different from the negligent and often cruel treatment that had characterized the facility under previous management. Dr. Jonathan Reeves was a man in his early 40s whose recent certification and idealistic commitment to genuine medical treatment rather than simple custodial care had led him to accept a position at Riverside Hospital with the intention of implementing reforms that would improve conditions for patients who had been written off by their families and ignored by society. Dr. Reeves' first encounter with Margaret had occurred during his systematic review of all patient files and conditions, a process that he had undertaken to understand the scope of problems at the institution and to identify patients who might benefit from different approaches to treatment and care. Margaret's case had caught his attention because the symptoms described in her admission documents seemed inconsistent with her current condition and because her behavior and communication skills suggested intelligence and mental clarity that contradicted the diagnosis of incurable mental illness that had justified her continued confinement. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Reeves had said during their first formal interview, "I have been reviewing your file and I must confess that I am puzzled by some discrepancies between your documented symptoms and my observations of your current condition. Would you be willing to help me understand what brought you to this institution and what your experience has been during your stay here?" Margaret's response to Dr. Reeves' questions had been cautious but hopeful, as she had gradually recognized that he was genuinely interested in her welfare and was approaching her case with the kind of professional competence and human compassion that had been completely absent from her previous interactions with medical staff at Riverside Hospital. Margaret had provided Dr. Reeves with a detailed account of her symptoms, her treatment by the children, her commitment to the institution, and her growing suspicions that she had been the victim of deliberate deception and fraud rather than the beneficiary of concerned family members seeking appropriate medical care for someone whose health had been compromised by grief and stress. Dr. Reeves' investigation of Margaret's case had revealed irregularities and inconsistencies that raised serious questions about the legitimacy of her diagnosis and commitment, including medical documents that contained conflicting information about her symptoms and condition, financial records that suggested her family had paid substantial sums to ensure her continued confinement rather than her treatment and recovery, and correspondence between the institution and the children that discussed Margaret's case in terms that were more consistent with custodial care than medical treatment. The discovery that Dr. Vale, who had initially diagnosed and committed Margaret, had received payments from Thomas Whitmore that far exceeded normal fees for medical consultation and evaluation had provided Dr. Reeves with the first concrete evidence that Margaret's commitment had been based on fraud rather than legitimate medical necessity. Further investigation had revealed that Dr. Vale was not properly certified to practice medicine in New York and had been involved in similar cases where wealthy families had paid him to provide false diagnoses that would justify the commitment of inconvenient relatives to institutions where they could be kept out of the way indefinitely. But the most shocking discovery in Dr. Reeves' investigation had been evidence that Henry Whitmore's death had not been from natural causes as reported but had resulted from poison administered gradually over several weeks in doses that would have been difficult to detect without sophisticated analysis that had not been performed on someone whose death was not initially considered suspicious. The symptoms that Margaret had experienced after Henry's death, which had been attributed to grief and mental instability, were actually consistent with exposure to the same poison that had killed her husband, suggesting that the children had attempted to murder her as well but had miscalculated the dosage and timing that would have been necessary to kill her quickly without arousing suspicion. The evidence that Dr. Reeves had assembled about Margaret's case had been sufficient to justify her immediate release from Riverside Hospital and the initiation of criminal proceedings against the children who had orchestrated her imprisonment while continuing to administer poison that was intended to eventually kill her or at least maintain her in a weakened state that would prevent her from challenging their control of her inheritance. Margaret's physical recovery from the effects of prolonged poisoning had been gradual but steady once she was removed from the source of contamination and provided with proper medical care, while her emotional healing from the trauma of betrayal and imprisonment had been more difficult and had required Dr. Reeves' continued support and encouragement. The legal battle that had followed Margaret's release from Riverside Hospital had been complicated by the children's wealth and social connections, which had allowed them to hire skilled attorneys and attempt to discredit Margaret's accusations by claiming that her supposed recovery was temporary and that her charges against them were the product of paranoid delusions brought on by her underlying mental condition. The children had also attempted to present themselves as devoted family members who had made difficult decisions in Margaret's best interests and who were being unfairly persecuted by someone whose illness had made her incapable of understanding their good intentions and genuine concern for her welfare. Dr. Reeves' testimony about the medical evidence of poisoning and the fraudulent nature of Margaret's original diagnosis had been crucial in establishing the credibility of her accusations and refuting the children's claims that she was mentally unstable and prone to paranoid fantasies about persecution by people who loved her. The discovery of correspondence between the children that revealed their detailed planning of both their father's murder and Margaret's destruction had provided additional evidence of their guilt while demonstrating the calculated nature of crimes that had been motivated purely by greed and had showed complete disregard for the welfare of people who had trusted them. The trial that had exposed the children's crimes had become one of New York's most sensational court cases, involving not only murder and fraud but also broader questions about the rights of patients in mental institutions and the safeguards that should exist to prevent the abuse of people who were vulnerable because of age, illness, or social isolation. Margaret's courage in testifying about her experiences and Dr. Reeves' professional integrity in risking his career to expose corruption within the medical establishment had provided inspiration for reforms that would protect other potential victims while ensuring that those responsible for such crimes faced appropriate consequences. The convictions of Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Whitmore on charges of murder, attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy had provided Margaret with the justice she had sought while also ensuring that they would face punishment proportionate to the magnitude of their crimes and the suffering they had caused to someone who had loved them unconditionally and had tried to provide them with every advantage and opportunity. The recovery of her inheritance and the restoration of her legal rights had given Margaret the resources and freedom she needed to rebuild her life and pursue goals that honored Henry's memory while creating something positive from the tragedy and betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. You know that moment when you realize the people you trusted most were the ones planning your destruction? Margaret lived that nightmare for 3 years. But her story teaches us that even in our darkest moments, there are guardian angels working to set us free. Dr. Reeves didn't just save Margaret's life, he restored her faith in human goodness and proved that love can triumph over even the most calculated evil. If someone has ever stood up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself, or if you've been the one to help someone escape from people who were hurting them, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. These tales of rescue and justice remind us that there are still heroes in this world, and knowing you're part of this community gives me hope that goodness will always win in the end. The relationship between Margaret and Dr. Reeves that had begun as doctor and patient had evolved naturally into something deeper and more meaningful as they had worked together to expose the crimes against her and as Margaret had recovered not only her physical health but also her ability to trust and love someone who had proven himself worthy of such precious gifts through his actions rather than his words. Dr. Reeves had been drawn to Margaret not only by professional admiration for her courage and intelligence but also by personal attraction to someone whose strength of character had allowed her to survive betrayal and imprisonment without losing her essential goodness and capacity for hope. Their courtship had been conducted with appropriate discretion and patience, allowing Margaret time to heal from the trauma of her experiences while giving Dr. Reeves the opportunity to prove that his feelings were based on genuine affection and respect rather than sympathy or professional obligation. Their marriage, which had taken place 18 months after Margaret's release from Riverside Hospital, had been a quiet ceremony attended by friends who had supported them during the legal proceedings and who understood that their union represented not only personal happiness but also the triumph of love and justice over greed and betrayal. Margaret and Dr. Reeves had used their combined resources and expertise to establish the Whitmore House for Healing, a facility that provided genuine medical care and compassionate support for people who had been failed by other institutions or who needed specialized treatment that addressed both physical and emotional trauma. Their approach to patient care had been revolutionary in its emphasis on dignity, respect, and individualized treatment that recognized each person's unique needs and potential for recovery, creating an environment where healing could occur naturally rather than being forced through harsh methods that often caused more harm than benefit. The success of Whitmore House for Healing had attracted patients from throughout the region and had served as a model for other institutions that were committed to genuine reform rather than simply maintaining the status quo that benefited administrators and staff while neglecting the needs of those they were supposed to serve. Margaret's role in the facility had drawn on her personal experience of institutional abuse to ensure that patients were treated with the kind of compassion and respect that she had been denied during her imprisonment, while Dr. Reeves' medical expertise had ensured that treatments were based on sound science rather than tradition or convenience. Among the patients who had found healing and new purpose at Whitmore House was Sarah Mitchell, a young woman whose family had committed her to an asylum after she had given birth to an illegitimate child, abandoning her to institutional care while keeping her infant daughter to be raised by relatives who wanted to erase the scandal of unmarried motherhood from their family history. Sarah's recovery under Margaret's care had been remarkable not only because of her improved mental and physical health but also because of her development of skills and confidence that had prepared her for independent life outside the institution. When Sarah's health had stabilized and her emotional healing had progressed to the point where she was ready to leave Whitmore House, Margaret had faced a difficult decision about the future of Sarah's infant daughter, Hope, who had been living at the facility since her birth and who had become attached to Margaret in ways that suggested she recognized her as a mother figure rather than simply a caregiver. Sarah's decision to entrust Hope's care to Margaret had been motivated by her understanding that she was not yet ready to provide the stability and security that a child needed, while her gratitude for the healing she had received had made her willing to sacrifice her maternal rights in order to ensure Hope's welfare. Margaret's adoption of Hope had fulfilled dreams of motherhood that she had never expected to realize, providing her with the opportunity to raise a child who would know only love and security rather than the betrayal and manipulation that had characterized her relationship with Henry's children. The joy that Hope brought to Margaret's life had been matched by the happiness she had given Dr. Reeves, who had embraced his role as father with the same dedication and compassion that he brought to his medical practice and his marriage. The family that Margaret and Dr. Reeves had created together had been built on foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to helping others who were vulnerable or suffering, creating a legacy that extended far beyond their personal happiness to include the lives they had saved and improved through their work at Whitmore House for Healing. Hope's upbringing in this environment of service and compassion had shaped her character in ways that prepared her to continue their work when she reached adulthood, ensuring that their values and mission would survive and flourish in future generations. Margaret's transformation from victim to survivor to healer had been complete when she had been able to use her experiences with betrayal and institutional abuse to help other people who were facing similar challenges, proving that even the most devastating tragedies can be transformed into sources of strength and wisdom that benefit not only the survivors but also those who come after them. The love between Margaret and Dr. Reeves had been strengthened by their shared mission and their recognition that their personal happiness was connected to their ability to create positive change in the world around them. The Whitmore House for Healing had continued to grow and evolve under their leadership, expanding its services to include training for medical professionals who were committed to compassionate care, research into treatments for conditions that had been misunderstood or neglected by conventional medicine, and advocacy for legal reforms that would protect vulnerable people from the kinds of abuse that Margaret had experienced. Their work had influenced medical education and practice throughout the region, while their model of institutional care had been adopted by other facilities that were committed to genuine healing rather than custodial warehousing of inconvenient people. Margaret's relationship with Hope had provided her with the kind of unconditional love and natural affection that she had sought with Henry's children but had never truly experienced because of their fundamental selfishness and manipulative nature. Hope's innocent trust and genuine affection had helped heal wounds that Margaret had thought would never fully close, while her development into a bright, compassionate child had given Margaret and Dr. Reeves hope for the future and confidence that goodness could triumph over evil when it was nurtured and protected by people who understood its value. The annual memorial service that Margaret and Dr. Reeves had established for Henry had become an occasion not only for honoring his memory but also for celebrating the triumph of justice over corruption and love over betrayal, reminding everyone who attended that individual acts of courage and compassion could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances to influence the lives of countless other people who needed hope and healing. Henry's legacy had been preserved not through the wealth he had accumulated but through the institutions and relationships that his widow had built after surviving the attempts to destroy her. The children who had betrayed Margaret had faced not only legal consequences for their crimes but also social ostracism and personal ruin that had left them isolated and bitter, serving as examples of how greed and cruelty ultimately destroy those who practice them while failing to achieve the goals that motivated their evil actions. Their imprisonment and loss of social standing had been less important to Margaret than her own recovery and the positive changes she had been able to create, but their fate had served as a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals of trust and family loyalty. Margaret's story had become part of the oral tradition that preserved moral instruction about the importance of treating vulnerable people with respect and protection rather than exploitation and abuse, while also demonstrating that justice, though sometimes delayed, was ultimately more powerful than wealth or social position when it was supported by truth and courage. Her example had inspired other women to resist attempts to control or silence them through false diagnoses and institutional commitment, while also encouraging medical professionals to question practices that prioritized convenience over genuine care. The letters that Margaret had written during her recovery and her years with Dr. Reeves had documented not only her personal journey from victim to survivor but also the broader social changes that their work had helped create, providing future generations with both inspiration and practical guidance about how to build institutions and relationships that served human dignity rather than simply maintaining power and privilege for those who already possessed advantages. The love story between Margaret and Dr. Reeves had demonstrated that genuine partnership could be based on shared values and mutual respect rather than simply romantic attraction or social convenience, while their success in creating both personal happiness and positive social change had proven that individual healing could be connected to broader efforts to improve conditions for everyone who was vulnerable or marginalized by circumstances beyond their control. Hope's childhood in the Whitmore House for Healing had provided her with unique preparation for understanding human nature and the importance of compassion in creating meaningful relationships, while her parents' example had taught her that privilege and resources were best used in service of others rather than simply for personal gratification or social advancement. Her education had included not only traditional academic subjects but also practical training in medical care and social service that had prepared her to continue the family mission of healing and justice. The expansion of Whitmore House for Healing to include training programs for other medical professionals had ensured that Margaret and Dr. Reeves' approach to patient care would influence practices at other institutions long after they were no longer able to provide direct leadership, creating a legacy that would benefit countless people who would never know the names of those who had fought to improve their treatment and prospects for recovery. Their emphasis on dignity and individualized care had become standard practice at facilities that were committed to genuine healing rather than simple custodial maintenance. Margaret's public speaking about her experiences had helped change attitudes about mental illness and institutional care while also educating families about warning signs that their relatives might be victims of abuse or fraud rather than recipients of appropriate medical treatment. Her courage in sharing painful personal details had been motivated by her desire to prevent other people from suffering as she had suffered and to ensure that vulnerable individuals had advocates who would fight for their rights and welfare. The gardens that Margaret had designed around Whitmore House for Healing had provided both therapeutic benefits for patients and symbols of renewal and growth that reminded everyone who visited the facility that healing was possible even after the most devastating experiences of betrayal and loss. Her attention to creating beautiful, peaceful environments had reflected her understanding that emotional recovery required not only medical treatment but also surroundings that inspired hope and confidence in the possibility of better days ahead. The friendship that had developed between Margaret and other women who had survived similar betrayals had created a support network that provided both practical assistance and emotional encouragement for people who were rebuilding their lives after discovering that those they had trusted most had been working against them. These relationships had demonstrated the importance of community and healing and had provided models for how genuine care and concern could replace the false relationships that had caused such devastating harm. As I reflect on Margaret's incredible journey from betrayal through imprisonment to healing and love, I'm struck by how one person's courage to seek truth can transform not only their own life but the lives of countless others who follow. Her story reminds us that our greatest tragedies can become the foundation for our most meaningful victories, and that love has the power to heal wounds we thought could never close. Dr. Reeves didn't just save Margaret from a corrupt system, he helped her transform her pain into purpose and her suffering into service. What moves me most about their story is how they used their personal healing to create healing for others, turning their love into a force for justice that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The Whitmore House for Healing became a beacon of hope because it was built on the understanding that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and genuine care, especially when they're most vulnerable. Have you ever experienced betrayal by people you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to rebuild your life and learn to trust again? Have you encountered someone like Dr. Reeves who helped restore your faith in human goodness? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, and if you know of other historical injustices that need to be told, please share those suggestions too. These conversations help us understand that we're not alone in our struggles and that there are always people willing to stand up for what's right. If Margaret's story has inspired you and shown you that love and justice can triumph over even the most calculated betrayals, please subscribe to hear more tales of people who transformed their pain into power and their suffering into service. Your support helps me continue preserving these stories that prove the human spirit is stronger than any force that tries to destroy it. I'm Eleanor, and I rescue stories that show us how the darkest chapters in our lives can become the opening pages of our most beautiful victories. Margaret and Dr. Reeves proved that when we choose love over hatred, healing over revenge, and service over selfishness, we create ripples of goodness that extend far beyond our own lives to touch generations we'll never meet. Their love story reminds us that our scars can become the very foundation of our strength, and our greatest betrayals can lead us to our most authentic victories.